Shabbat Shalom, everyone. All right, I just have to tell you what's got me so upset right now, and that is I've been reading accounts of doctors in Europe from the year 1520, and I just think we need to posthumously go back and indict them all for crimes against humanity, for murder, because I found out that they were not using penicillin to treat their patients with infections. How many people died? Right. Absurd, beyond belief. The age of penicillin began in 1928. Scottish physician Alexander Fleming. That was the beginning of what has saved how many lives in the last nearly 100 years at this point. And of course, judging someone in a time in the distant past for the non-use of a tool that did not exist at their time is absurd. Except for we do it all the time. We just don't usually see it as absurd. And the specific reason I'm thinking of it is one of the passages that's used in a very similar way. We're in Parashat Behar, and it's a priestly text dealing with various issues of morality within the society at the time, including several verses on slavery, which I'm not even going to go into detail because I want to deal with this from a meta standpoint, and that is especially the very low-resolution straw man way that many people, like such eminent figures as Richard Dawkins, the way that they have turned their straw man view of Torah or of scripture used by multiple religions into an attack to show that they are morally superior and the texts are morally vacuous or void. And I pick on Professor Dr. Richard Dawkins quite a bit in my book, and because the man wrote amazing books like The Selfish Gene, which quite frankly I think everyone should read. It's one of those universal, highly influential books that is just important. And then he wrote books like The God Delusion, which is several hundred pages of straw man arguments without actually ever listening to someone who, I know he talked with rabbis like Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, but he never internalized anything other than his already preconceived notion. He could not hear the elevated interpretive process looking at those things. So I've been arguing with myself and trying to actually find ways to express this for quite some time. And so when I saw this passage this week, I thought, well, let me just read a little passage from my book because I have been dealing with this. And this is specifically after talking about Richard Dawkins a bit. I wrote this passage. This is pretty early on in the book. When, for example, I hear the standard canards such as, if God was so wise, then why wasn't slavery outlawed in the Torah? I don't cringe and try to defend the verses of Torah that clearly accept slavery as part of the reality of society. Instead, I focus on two other questions. One, what does the narrative about slavery at the time of Torah show that is different from the surrounding cultures? And two, are we, today, actually free of the thing that we are criticizing? The answer to the first is that contained within the slavery system are provisions for release, something that doesn't seem to have been shared among all neighboring empires at the time of the Torah was written, and therefore needs to be considered as part of the understanding of questions of morals and ethics within the development of Jewish thought. The answer to the second is that sadly there is slavery all over the world now, today. And around the corner from the person who mocked Judaism's backward morality and transitively praised their own clearly superior, chances are there is an establishment with trafficked persons. I as well would love to be able to point to a clear verse that leapt ahead of all of humanity and commanded an end to slavery. But the argument that the Torah is null and void because it does not do this is ignorant and vacuous. The person who mocks the morality of the Torah and ignores the flourishing of that same thing that they mocked around the corner from their flat loses points in the argument. Right, the argument goes something like, yeah, but if God is omniscient and omnipotent and omnipresent, then that God would have been wise enough to say, thou shalt not have slaves. All right, let's just take that seriously for a second. Let's pretend that the Torah is talking about Santa Claus, who's, checking if we're naughty or nice, and, or the bearded version on the Sistine Chapel. Let's just pretend that's real for a second, and let's go for some analogy that might work out a little bit. Think of the very first time you fell in love. Now, I'm talking about that teenage, head over heels, I can't live without this person, I'm listening to every love ballad from the 80s, every song from Chicago 17, Madonna's Crazy for You. I mean, come on, if you grew up in the 80s, you know what I'm talking about. The best decade in the world to have, I can't live without that person, unrequited love, right? So you listen to all that music, you can't live without this person, head over heels, that sort of thing. And at some point in that crazy first love, whether it's returned or not, some wise person who's lived a little bit of life had a conversation with us. Now, let me recount an elevated version that I wish it wouldn't have had any better effect, but I wish would have been given to me. It would have gone something like this. I hear you. I remember when this same thing happened to me. I remember the feelings, and enjoy this moment. Enjoy this feeling. You will remember this the rest of your life. It's such a powerful feeling. Also, in addition, remember that you will continue to grow and change, and the person that you love so dearly will continue to grow and change. And you will grow apart. It's inevitable. It's what happens to humans. And especially where you are in life right now, you will evolve and change dramatically. And you might even have your heart broken as both of you change, because that's what happens. Human beings treat each other poorly sometimes. And eventually, as you continue to grow and evolve, you will have the opportunity to meet other remarkable people who have also evolved on parallel and complementary paths until you do meet that partner that you will possibly spend the rest of your life with. Now, if I had heard that version, I would have listened to it no more than the version that I actually heard, which is something like, "You stupid idiot, what are you doing? Don't you know that this is, what do you mean you fall in love with you? You don't know what love is." Okay, we all know the version that we actually heard, and of course we didn't react to that, even though the person was right. We didn't know what love on a grander scale is. We knew a low resolution version of it at the time. But we didn't actually understand that perspective because we existed in that moment within that chemical soup, within those feelings, within the reality the full reality of the moment, that we could not live without that person. And it's not possible to hear even correct, wise, lived experience saying, be careful, things are going to change. And if you are one of the people out there who did fall in love at 12 and stayed in love and that became your partner and you're still with that person and it is that love to last a lifetime, you are the exception that proves the rule. You are not the exception that proves me wrong. And that's exactly what an anthropomorphic God saying, "Thou shalt not have slavery," in a time where everyone had slaves, it would have gone over in exactly the same way. And so instead we have the greater gift of a Torah that shows evolution of morality. All of our morality evolves over time, and the Torah reflects that. And if we expect that the entire purpose of Torah is to show an anthropomorphic God that says this is the end of all morality, then we've misunderstood what's in front of us. There is universal ethics that have not changed, that are expressed in Jewish and Torah tradition. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the stranger in your midst as yourself, because you were once slaves in Egypt. And then slightly later on, Hill of the Elder, that which is reprehensible to you, do not do to someone else. We have all those tools there, but we keep on having ritual traditions and interpretive traditions in order to deal with that, because we don't act that way. We don't love our neighbors as ourselves. We do not treat the stranger in our midst as ourselves, because we were once strangers in Egypt. And we do not avoid treating others in a way that we ourselves would never want to be treated. And so we have the continual evolving tradition. We have the universal ethic there. If you take seriously the idea, do not do to someone else that was just reprehensible to you, we already have in Jewish tradition, do not hold slaves. But Jewish tradition, like so many other religions, acknowledges the facts that we never live up to the highest elevated potential of our religious texts. Therefore, we keep on adding local momentary rules to deal with the reality of the moment until our version of ethics and our ability to see when we are hypocrites actually becomes as high resolution as the beauty of the texts that our tradition is based on. But to close it out, when I say close it out, that usually means another 5-10 minutes, but to close it out, there's another part, and that's how we deal with this individually. Because hopefully you already heard when I talked about the absurdity of judging someone for not using a tool they didn't have in 1520. I don't want to be judged for what I did when I was 16. I want to learn from it. But I don't want anyone to dig through my old poetry books, my old journals, to have memories of how stupid I acted, or even at 25, or even at 35, or even at 45, or quite frankly, even yesterday. But our society is now predicated upon that. We judge each other as if they were in 1520 and should have been using penicillin. We all develop tools as we gain them. And then sometimes we discard tools that no longer work. We are all in a process of evolution. And we've got multiple choices of how to deal with that. And what we tend to choose is judging people as harshly as we can without any benefit of the doubt. And if the penicillin analogy seems absurd, well, think about it. How often do we engage in analogous behavior? There's a beautiful passage right at the beginning of Pirkei Avot, which I think really brings us full circle. In this entire section of Pirkei Avot, this beginning is dealing with the genealogy, but a spiritual and education, wisdom genealogy. Usually in the Torah, genealogies are this person begat this person, and so forth in order to show legitimacy of lineage, tribal legitimacy. But this is religious, philosophical, spiritual, moral, and ethical legitimacy, and it's talking about Torah received by Moses on Sinai and passing it down. Eventually we get to the early members of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, so the proto-organization that eventually became the Talmudic rabbis, that became Chazal, the wise ones of blessed memory. And we get, after this genealogy of Moses passed on this oral tradition, this dialogic and dialectic tradition that all of Judaism is based on, and we get the epitomizations of what that means. What elevated ethical and moral statements come from these early leaders who wrestled with these thoughts. My favorite one is right at the beginning from the 6th Mishnah, and it is Yeshua ben Perariah and Nittai the Arbelite received the oral tradition from them, so from all these other people, and this is what they used to say. Aselecha Rav, so get yourself a Rav, get yourself a teacher, all right? And then acquire for yourself a companion, that is Uknei lecha Chaver, so get yourself a chavruta partner, a study partner, someone with which to learn. So you're learning from a teacher and you're studying with someone of equality. And what does that bring about? And judge all people with the scale weighted in their favor. That's called the benefit of the doubt. Someone says something stupid to me. Yes, we have the right and the ability and even the obligation to protect ourselves. And there are times when we should call something out without a doubt. There are absolutely moments, but that has become our first instinct. It should be the last resort. If you want to see what can happen, look at the story of Megan Phelps. If there's anyone to be called out, and rightfully called out over and over again, if you have any relationship to the past decades in the United States of America, we've got Westboro Baptist Church, and this is about as horrific as it gets. But one of the granddaughters, who used to be one of the ones picketing with the most horrific signs that we can imagine, had someone who gave her the benefit of the doubt and responded to her hatred with, responded to her bigotry with, I don't understand that. I want to understand where you come from. Just happened to be a Jewish guy, by the way, and some of those signs used to say, and still say, God hates the Jews, right? And over the course of several years of Twitter as well as personal back and forth, Megan Phelps is no longer a part of that church. Listen to her TED Talk, listen to her long-form interviews. It is exactly what happens when we realize that unless someone is a psychopath, they believe that whatever they're saying is to the best. And they might not have had the privilege of having a mom, in my case, who said, treat people well. A dad who said, don't play games, work hard, and act ethically in the workplace. Doesn't mean I've done it. Doesn't mean I've ever lived up as I should to the ideals that I learned. But I had the privilege of having parents that taught and instilled that. A mom who was so completely and wonderfully anti-racism and anti-bigotry that I had the opportunity to grow up with saying, that's bad. Not everyone actually had the opportunity to hear that. And yes, there are people who utter things of such utter, absolute, complete stupidity. And many things that are uttered should be condemned without a doubt. But they're a human being who also has the opportunity to learn if someone ever reacts with curiosity. I don't understand that. I'd like to know where you're coming from. You know what? I'm not going to assume that I understand everything about you. You know what? I'm not going to assume that everything that I utter is without some level of bigotry. So instead of assuming that I'm morally superior, I'm just going to go ahead and listen a little while. This is not what we're being taught today. We're taught to condemn. Talmudic tradition, Torah tradition is saying, be a little bit more gentle with that one. Because the basic underlying ethics is listen to someone the way that we'd want to be listened to in our absolute greatest moments of stupidity, of ignorance, of bigotry, of not yet having a moment of realizing just how much we as human beings fall short. How do we get there? Well, that's what this passage in Pirkei Avot is all about. How do our judgments become based on benefit of the doubt? We have a teacher and we have someone with whom we're studying. The teacher, not someone who's teaching us what we already know. That's called an externalization of our ego. Someone who's going to challenge us with thoughts that we haven't thought before. Maybe even things we don't want to hear or don't like to hear. And that chavruta, that's not a person who's going to repeat back to us what we already believe. That's an externalization of our ego. It's the person who's going to say, I disagree with you. I look at it this way. One of my closest friends on the face of this planet was my chavruta partner in Jerusalem studying at Steinsaltz, Rabbi Yonah Zimon. ended up marrying Katrine and I, or, doing the marriage ceremony. Doesn't work in English all the time, does it? And I used to sit there, we'd read a passage together, and I'd go through look at the symbols and look at the metaphors, and I like hearing myself speak a little bit, and you'd nod and smile, and that's great, and then come to his part, and he'd say, yeah, but the text says this. These are the words that are written. Looked at the exact same text and saw two completely different worlds, forced each of our minds to expand, even though we saw things differently. Some of my closest friends on the face of this planet, not in spite of that, but because of that. So that's a clear tool, and I think that this analogy is another good one. Whenever we get ready to type those words of condemnation, or to call someone out in that moment, or to call someone out for that thing we found out that they did 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, or even yesterday, are we calling them out for not using penicillin in the year 1520, or are we recognizing who they are today? If we're calling someone out for who they are today, that's at least some level of reality. But what the Torah tradition is asking us to do is to look at someone's words based on the potential of who they could be tomorrow, and to have that relationship with them. And that's harder than hell. It's also a pathway for not tearing ourselves apart in quite the same way that we are. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We'll see you next time.
שיר חדש שירו לאדוני כל הארץ